The morning sun was barely peeking through the gray clouds as Sarah Mitchell adjusted her rearview mirror. She was running slightly behind schedule for her morning committee meeting on Capitol Hill. The digital clock on her car dashboard showed 8:15 a.m., and she needed to be there by 8:45 a.m. Sarah had never been late for a meeting in her 6 years as a member of Congress, and she wasn't planning to start now. Driving her modest Toyota Camry through the streets of Washington, D.C., Sarah stayed focused on the road. She wasn't one for flashy cars or drawing attention to herself. At 45 years old, she had worked too hard to get where she was, from a small-town girl in Georgia to becoming one of the most respected voices in Congress. Today, she wore a simple navy blue suit, her curly black hair neatly tied back, and minimal jewelry. Her congressional pin sat in her purse, as it usually did when she wasn't at official functions. The traffic was lighter than usual on this Tuesday morning. Sarah carefully followed all traffic rules, just as she always did. As she approached the intersection of 14th Street, the traffic light turned yellow. Sarah, who was already too close to stop safely, continued through the intersection. In her rear-view mirror, she noticed the flash of red and blue lights. "What now?" she muttered to herself, pulling over to the right side of the road. She had been driving these streets for years and knew she hadn't done anything wrong. Officer Mike Peterson, a young white police officer with just 2 years on the force, approached her car. Sarah rolled down her window and placed both hands on the steering wheel, a habit her father had taught her years ago. "License and registration," Officer Peterson demanded, not bothering with a greeting. His hand rested casually on his gun holster, a detail that didn't escape Sarah's notice. "Good morning, officer," Sarah responded calmly, maintaining her composure. "May I reach for my documents in the glove compartment?" The officer nodded curtly. As Sarah retrieved her papers, she noticed how the officer's eyes narrowed, scanning her car interior as if expecting to find something suspicious. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Officer Peterson asked, his tone carrying that familiar edge she had encountered too many times before. "No, sir, I don't," Sarah replied honestly. "I was following all traffic rules." "You ran a yellow light back there," he said, looking at her license. "Miss Mitchell, that's a violation of Traffic Code 22,450. Sarah knew her rights in the law. "Officer, with all due respect, I was already in the intersection when the light turned yellow. It would have been more dangerous to stop suddenly." The officer's face hardened at her response. "Ma'am, are you trying to tell me how to do my job?" "Not at all, officer," Sarah replied, keeping her voice steady despite her rising frustration. "I'm simply explaining what happened." Officer Peterson took out his ticket book, his pen moving across the paper with quick, sharp strokes. "Here's your ticket. You can either pay the fine or contest it in court within 30 days. He thrust the ticket through her window without further explanation. Sarah looked at the citation. $300 for running a yellow light. The amount was unusually high for such a minor alleged offense, and she knew it. As the officer walked away, Sarah noticed him smirking while talking into his radio. She took a deep breath, folded the ticket carefully, and placed it in her purse. Next to it lay her congressional pin, its gold surface catching the morning light. Looking at her watch, Sarah realized she would barely make it to her meeting now. But as she sat there, she made a decision. She would contest this ticket, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever faced similar treatment. As a member of the House Judiciary Committee, she had seen the statistics on racial bias in traffic stops. Now, she was experiencing it firsthand. Starting her car again, Sarah merged back into traffic. Little did Officer Peterson know, his actions that morning would soon lead to one of the most talked-about incidents in the D.C. court system. But for now, Sarah focused on her upcoming meeting, where, ironically, they would be discussing police reform and judicial accountability. The morning sun finally broke through the clouds as she drove toward Capitol Hill, her mind already planning her next steps. This incident would not be just another statistic, it would become a catalyst for change. 2 weeks after receiving the ticket, Sarah Mitchell stood outside the Washington, D.C. District Courthouse. The large stone building looked imposing against the bright blue sky. It was 9:15 a.m., and her case was scheduled for 10 o'clock a.m. Sarah always believed in being early, especially for important matters like this. She had chosen her outfit carefully that morning, a simple black skirt suit and low heels. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and she carried a plain leather briefcase containing her evidence. The dashboard camera footage from her car showing the yellow light incident. Once again, her congressional pin remained in her purse. Sarah wanted to be treated just like any other citizen today. As she climbed the courthouse steps, she noticed other people arriving for their cases. A young Hispanic mother struggled with a baby stroller while trying to hold her court papers. Without hesitation, Sarah stepped forward to help her with the door. The woman smiled gratefully, introducing herself as Maria. "Are you here for traffic court too?" Maria asked, trying to quiet her fussy baby. "Yes," Sarah replied, walking alongside her. "Yellow light violation." "You?" "Parking ticket," Maria sighed. "I was only 2 minutes late to the meter, but the fine is $200. I can't afford it on my waitress salary, but missing work today to contest it means losing more money." Sarah nodded sympathetically, making a mental note about how the system often hit hardest those who could least afford it. As they reached the security checkpoint, she observed something interesting. A well-dressed white businessman in front of them walked through with barely a glance from the guards. However, when it was their turn, both Sarah and Maria received much closer scrutiny. The security guard made Maria wake her sleeping baby to check under the blanket. He then spent an unusually long time examining Sarah's briefcase, flipping through every paper inside. Sarah remained calm, knowing this was exactly the kind of behavior she fought against in Congress. Inside the crowded courthouse hallway, Sarah noticed clear patterns in how people were treated. Court officials spoke sharply to some while being overly polite to others. The patterns usually fell along racial and social class lines. She watched as a clerk rudely dismissed an elderly black man's questions about where to file his papers, while patiently explaining similar information to a young white woman just moments later. Finding courtroom 4B, Sarah and Maria sat together in the wooden benches. The room was already half full, and Sarah noticed she was one of only 3 black people present. The air conditioning hummed loudly overhead, and the fluorescent lights cast a harsh glare on everything. "Next time, I'll just pay the ticket," Maria whispered, bouncing her baby gently. "This feels like a waste of time." "Don't give up," Sarah encouraged her quietly. "Everyone deserves a fair hearing." As they waited, Sarah observed Judge William Henderson through the open chamber door. He was talking and laughing with some attorneys in his office, all of them white men in expensive suits. When a young black attorney tried to join their conversation, the judge's smile disappeared, and he quickly ended the discussion. Sarah pulled out her notebook and started writing down everything she noticed. As a member of the House Judiciary Committee, these observations would be valuable for their upcoming hearings on court reform. She had heard complaints about Judge Henderson before, but seeing it firsthand was different. At 9:55 a.m., the bailiff entered and started organizing the morning's cases. Sarah noticed him placing certain files at the top of the pile while moving others to the bottom. She watched as he gave preferential treatment to some lawyers who walked in late, moving their cases up in the queue despite others waiting longer. The clock struck 10 o'clock a.m., and Judge Henderson entered the courtroom. Everyone stood as required. Sarah could feel the tension in the room rise. The judge's reputation for being harsh with certain defendants while lenient with others was well known in the D.C. legal community. As she waited for her case to be called, Sarah felt her congressional pin in her purse. Soon, Judge Henderson would learn an important lesson about making assumptions. But for now, she sat quietly, gathering evidence not just for her traffic case, but for something much bigger. A chance to expose the daily injustices that occurred in courtrooms across America. Case number 247, Sarah Mitchell, traffic violation, the court clerk announced in a bored voice. Sarah stood up, straightened her suit jacket, and walked confidently to the podium in front of Judge Henderson's bench. She could feel Maria giving her an encouraging smile from the back of the courtroom. The harsh fluorescent lights made the judge's already stern face look even more severe. Judge William Henderson barely looked up from his papers. His gray hair was perfectly combed, and his black robe was crisp and spotless. He had been a judge for 20 years, and everyone knew he took pride in running his courtroom with strict control. Some called it discipline, others called it something else entirely. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, emphasizing the Ms. in a slightly mocking tone, "you're here to contest a traffic violation for running a yellow light. How you pled?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Sarah replied clearly, standing straight and maintaining eye contact. The judge finally looked up, his blue eyes narrowing as he studied her, his mouth turned down slightly at the corners. Officer Peterson's report states that you were argumentative during the traffic stop. Is that your usual behavior with law enforcement? Sarah kept her voice steady, though she felt her frustration rising. With all due respect, Your Honor, I was not argumentative. I simply tried to explain my position calmly and professionally. Judge Henderson leaned back in his chair, a small smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Ms. Mitchell, in my experience, people who say, with all due respect, usually mean the opposite. A few white lawyers standing at the back of the courtroom chuckled. Sarah noticed that Officer Peterson had slipped into the courtroom and was now standing near the door, watching with interest. Your Honor, I have evidence to present, Sarah said, reaching for her briefcase. My car's dashboard camera recorded the entire incident, showing that I was already in the intersection when the light turned yellow. According to Traffic Code 22,450, my actions were completely legal. The judge waved his hand dismissively. Ms. Mitchell, are you attempting to lecture this court about traffic laws? No, Your Honor. I'm simply presenting evidence for my defense, which is my right under. I'm well aware of legal rights, Ms. Mitchell, Judge Henderson interrupted sharply. I've been practicing law since before you were born, I suspect. Sarah bit back her response, knowing that at 45, she was hardly a young woman, but the judge's assumption was telling. She tried again. Your Honor, if you could just review the video evidence. That won't be necessary. Judge Henderson cut her off again. Officer Peterson is a decorated member of our police force. His judgment in the field carries significant weight in this courtroom. Sarah glanced at Officer Peterson, who now wore a satisfied smile. She noticed how the judge referred to him as officer with respect, while consistently calling her Ms. in that condescending tone. Furthermore, the judge continued, shuffling some papers on his desk, your attitude today confirms Officer Peterson's report about your behavior. This court does not look kindly on citizens who disrespect law enforcement. Sarah's hand instinctively moved toward her purse, where her congressional pin lay hidden. But she held back. She wanted to see exactly how far this would go. Your Honor, I have the right to present evidence in my defense, she stated firmly. Judge Henderson's face reddened slightly. Ms. Mitchell, I'm adding contempt of court to your charges. The original fine was $300. With the addition of court fees and this contempt charge, your total fine is now $750. Pay it within 30 days or face additional penalties. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Even some of the court staff looked uncomfortable with the judge's harsh response. Maria, still sitting in the back, held her baby closer and shook her head in disbelief. Sarah stood perfectly still, her expression calm despite the injustice unfolding. 20 years on this bench had made Judge Henderson comfortable with his power, perhaps too comfortable. He was about to learn an important lesson about making assumptions. Do you have anything else to say, Ms. Mitchell? Judge Henderson asked, already reaching for his gavel to dismiss her. Sarah smiled slightly, finally reaching for her purse. Actually, Your Honor, I do have something to say, but first, let me properly introduce myself. The congressional pin felt heavy in her hand as she prepared to turn this routine traffic court session into a moment that would be remembered in Washington, D.C. for years to come. The courtroom fell silent as Sarah Mitchell reached into her purse. Judge Henderson was already looking down at his next case file, clearly done with what he thought was just another defiant defendant. He didn't notice how the bailiff's eyes widened as Sarah pulled out her golden congressional pin. With steady hands, Sarah attached the pin to her lapel. The small eagle symbol caught the fluorescent light, drawing attention from those nearest to her. A young law clerk gasped softly, recognizing what it meant. Officer Peterson's smug smile began to fade as he squinted to get a better look at the pin. Your Honor. Sarah's voice rang clear and strong through the courtroom. I believe it's important to properly identify myself for the court record. I am Congresswoman Sarah Mitchell, representing Georgia's 5th District, and I currently serve on the House Judiciary Committee. Judge Henderson's head snapped up so quickly that his reading glasses fell askew. His face, which had been slightly red with irritation, now turned pale. The gavel in his hand froze midair, where he had been about to bang it to end the session. I beg your pardon, he stammered, all his previous arrogance vanishing. Additionally, Sarah continued calmly, I'm the co-chair of the Congressional Oversight Committee on Judicial Conduct and a leading sponsor of the Judicial Accountability Act, which, as you may know, is currently moving through Congress. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Maria, still sitting in the back with her baby, covered her mouth to hide her smile. Officer Peterson had taken several steps backward, suddenly finding the exit door very interesting. I have here. Sarah pulled out a small recorder from her briefcase, an audio recording of today's proceedings, along with detailed notes about the systematic bias I've observed in this courtroom over the past hour. This includes the preferential treatment of certain defendants based on their race and social status. Judge Henderson tried to regain his composure, straightening his glasses and clearing his throat. Congresswoman Mitchell, had I known. That's precisely the point, Your Honor. Sarah interrupted firmly but respectfully. You shouldn't need to know my position to treat me, or anyone else in this courtroom, with basic dignity and respect. She gestured toward Maria and the others waiting for their cases. Every person who comes before this bench deserves to have their evidence heard, their rights protected, and their humanity acknowledged. The fact that you treated some defendants differently based on their appearance or perceived status is exactly why we need stronger oversight of our judicial system. The court reporter's fingers flew across her keyboard, recording every word. Several people in the gallery had pulled out their phones, although court rules prohibited recording. Even the bailiff made no move to stop them, too stunned by the unfolding scene. Now, Sarah continued, her voice steady and professional, I would like to present my dashboard camera evidence, as is my right. After that, I suggest we discuss the somewhat excessive $750 fine you just imposed, which seems to be significantly higher than the standard fee schedule for similar violations. Judge Henderson's hands were visibly shaking as he reached for Sarah's evidence folder. Of course, Congresswoman, please proceed. The same clerk who had been so dismissive earlier now rushed forward to help set up the video equipment, nearly tripping over himself in his hurry. Officer Peterson had completely disappeared from the courtroom. Sarah glanced around the room, noting how everyone's behavior had suddenly changed. The lawyers who had been chuckling earlier now looked mortified. The court staff who had ignored defendants' questions were suddenly attentive and helpful. And Your Honor, Sarah added, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent courtroom, after we review my case, I would like to discuss Mrs. Maria Gonzalez's parking ticket as well. I believe there might be some inconsistencies in how these minor violations are being handled in your courtroom. Judge Henderson could only nod, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. He knew, as did everyone else in the room, that this routine traffic court session had just become something much more significant. Sarah stood tall at the podium, her congressional pin gleaming under the lights, ready to ensure that justice would truly be blind in this courtroom, today and every day after. By 3 p.m. that same day, the story of what happened in courtroom 4B had spread like wildfire through the Washington, D.C. courthouse. Someone had managed to record a short video of Sarah Mitchell's revelation despite the no-phone policy, and it was already going viral on social media. Sarah sat in her congressional office, watching the video play on the evening news. The headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen read, Congresswoman exposes judicial bias in traffic court. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since she left the courthouse. Congresswoman, her assistant Rachel poked her head in, CNN is on line 1, and NBC is waiting on line 2. The Washington Post reporter is sitting in the lobby, and your social media mentions have exploded. Sarah took a deep breath, remembering how differently the day had ended from its beginning. After she had revealed her identity, Judge Henderson had quickly dismissed her traffic ticket, reviewing her dashboard camera footage in record time. He had also mysteriously lost Maria's parking ticket paperwork, effectively dismissing her case too. Put CNN on hold, Sarah told Rachel, and call Maria Gonzalez first. I want to make sure she's okay after all this attention. As Sarah waited for the call to connect, she watched more news coverage. The courthouse security cameras had caught Officer Peterson hurriedly leaving the building, and that footage was now playing on repeat on every major news channel. Hello. Maria's voice came through the phone, sounding nervous. Maria, this is Congresswoman Mitchell. How are you holding up? Oh, Congresswoman, you won't believe it. 3 news vans are parked outside my apartment. My sister says I'm trending on Twitter as parking ticket mom. Sarah could hear Maria's baby cooing in the background. I'm sorry about all the attention, but your story is helping expose a bigger problem. Would you be willing to tell it? While they talked, Sarah's email inbox kept filling up. Other people began sharing their stories of facing bias in Judge Henderson's courtroom. A pattern was emerging, one that couldn't be ignored anymore. By early evening, the story had taken on a life of its own. Legal experts were appearing on TV, discussing judicial accountability. Social media was flooded with similar stories from across the country. The hashtag courtroom equality was trending nationwide. Sarah's office had compiled over 50 similar complaints about Judge Henderson from the past year alone. The data showed a clear pattern. Defendants of color received fines averaging 70% higher than white defendants for the same offenses. Congresswoman Rachel interrupted again. The Chief Justice of the D.C. Superior Court is on the phone. He wants to discuss Judge Henderson's conduct personally. Before Sarah could respond, her cell phone buzzed with a text from another Congress member. Emergency Judiciary Committee meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. Your traffic stop just opened a huge can of worms. Looking out her office window at the Capitol building, Sarah thought about how a simple yellow light had led to all this. She picked up a framed photo from her desk, one of her father, who had always taught her to stand up for what was right. The evening news was now showing side-by-side statistics of Judge Henderson's ruling patterns. Someone had dug up 10 years' worth of his court records, revealing disturbing trends in how he handled cases based on race and social status. Rachel, Sarah called out, "Get me the latest draft of the Judicial Accountability Act. I think it needs some updating." As she worked into the evening, Sarah's phone kept buzzing with messages of support. Other members of Congress were pledging to co-sponsor her bill. Civil rights organizations were calling for investigations into other judges' conduct across the country. The last email of the day came from an unexpected source, Judge Henderson's clerk. The subject line read, "More evidence." Attached were documents showing similar patterns of bias in other courtrooms across the district. Sarah leaned back in her chair, realizing that her simple traffic ticket had sparked something much bigger than she'd anticipated. Tomorrow would bring congressional hearings, media interviews, and a long fight for reform. But for now, she smiled, knowing that sometimes justice needed a push in the right direction. On her desk, her congressional pin caught the light of the setting sun, reminding her that with power comes responsibility. Responsibility to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. The next morning, the House Judiciary Committee room buzzed with activity. News cameras lined the back wall, and every seat was filled. Sarah Mitchell sat at the committee table, her evidence folders neatly arranged before her. The clock showed 8:55 a.m., 5 minutes before the emergency hearing would begin. "Turn on CNN," whispered Rachel, Sarah's assistant, sliding into the seat behind her. On the small monitor at the desk, Judge Henderson was making a public statement outside the courthouse. His face looked tired, and his hands shook slightly as he held his prepared speech. "I deeply regret my actions in court yesterday," he read stiffly. "My behavior was unprofessional and did not reflect the standards of justice our courts should uphold." Sarah noticed how different he looked from yesterday. Gone was the arrogant man who had dismissed her evidence without a second thought. Now he seemed smaller, almost frightened, as reporters shouted questions at him. Congresswoman Mitchell called out a young reporter from the Washington Post. "Can you comment on the hundreds of cases now being reviewed from Judge Henderson's court?" Before Sarah could answer, the committee chairperson entered the room. Everyone stood as Congressman James Williams, a veteran legislator from Michigan, took his seat at the center of the long table. "This emergency session of the House Judiciary Committee will come to order," he announced, bringing down his gavel. "Our first order of business is to address the disturbing events that occurred yesterday in the D.C. District Court." The room fell silent as Sarah was called to testify. She walked to the witness table, thinking about Maria and all the others who had faced similar treatment but hadn't had a congressional pin to protect them. "Congresswoman Mitchell," began Chairman Williams, "please tell us exactly what happened in Judge Henderson's courtroom." For the next 30 minutes, Sarah detailed everything, from the initial traffic stop to the judge's biased behavior. She presented statistics showing how Judge Henderson had consistently given harsher penalties to people of color. "We've received this morning," Sarah continued, holding up a thick folder, over 200 new complaints about similar incidents in Judge Henderson's court. But this isn't just about one judge. This is about a system that allows such bias to go unchecked. In the audience, Maria sat with her baby, ready to testify next. Behind her were dozens of other people who had come forward with their own stories of facing unfair treatment in court. "Look at this data," Sarah said, pointing to a large screen showing graphs and charts. In traffic court alone, Black and Hispanic defendants pay an average of 70% more in fines than white defendants for the same violations. How is this justice? During a brief break, Rachel rushed over with more news. Officer Peterson has been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation, and 3 other judges in D.C. have suddenly announced their early retirement. Sarah nodded, knowing this was just the beginning. Her phone buzzed with a message from the president's office. He wanted to meet to discuss judicial reform legislation. Back in session, the committee watched the courthouse security footage. Everyone could see how differently Judge Henderson treated people based on their appearance. The evidence was undeniable. "We're not just looking at traffic tickets anymore," announced Chairman Williams. "The Department of Justice has opened a full investigation into systemic bias in our court system." By late afternoon, the hearing had turned into a major moment for judicial reform. Sarah's updated Judicial Accountability Act was gaining support from both political parties. News channels were running special reports on court bias across the country. This morning, Sarah addressed the committee in her closing statement. "I received a letter from a 12-year-old girl. She watched what happened in that courtroom and wrote, 'Thank you for showing me that one person can make a difference.'" Sarah paused, looking around the packed room. "But this isn't about one person. It's about every American's right to fair treatment under the law. That right shouldn't depend on the color of your skin, the clothes you wear, or the title you hold." As the session ended, Sarah knew their work was just beginning. But something had changed. People were finally paying attention to a problem that had been ignored for too long. Outside the hearing room, Maria hugged her tightly. "You did it," she whispered. "You made them listen." Sarah smiled, knowing that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments, even something as simple as a yellow light. 1 month after the traffic court incident, Sarah Mitchell stood at her office window, watching protesters gather outside the courthouse across the street. Their signs read "Justice for All" and "Reform Our Courts Now." What had started with a simple traffic ticket had grown into a national movement. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maria. "Just testified at the state Senate. They're voting on the Fair Courts Act tomorrow." Attached was a photo of Maria speaking at a podium, her baby sleeping peacefully in a carrier next to her. She had become a powerful voice for court reform, sharing her story on national television and at community meetings. Congresswoman Rachel entered with the morning's reports. Judge Henderson's review board made their decision. Sarah picked up the thick envelope. After weeks of investigation, they had reviewed over 1,000 of Henderson's past cases. The results were worse than anyone had expected. Clear patterns of discrimination appeared in everything from traffic fines to small claims court decisions. "He's been removed from the bench," Rachel continued, "and they're reviewing 5 other judges who showed similar patterns." Sarah remembered Judge Henderson's last day in court 2 weeks ago. He had looked old and tired as he packed up his office, very different from the arrogant man who had tried to fine her $750. His final statement to the press had been surprising. "I never thought I was biased, but the numbers don't lie. I failed to deliver equal justice, and for that, I am truly sorry." The morning news played on the office TV. They were showing clips from yesterday's police department press conference. Officer Peterson and 3 other officers had been required to complete extensive retraining. The department had also introduced new rules about traffic stops and bias training. "Your 10 a.m. is here," Rachel announced. The new judicial training team. Sarah welcomed a group of experts who had helped design a new program for judges. Every judge in D.C. would now have to complete monthly bias training and have their decisions regularly reviewed for fairness. The program would soon expand to other cities. "We've already had 30 judges sign up voluntarily," explained Dr. Thompson, the team leader. "They don't want to be the next Judge Henderson." During lunch, Sarah met with Maria at a small cafe near the courthouse. Maria's parking ticket story had inspired others to come forward. She now led a community group helping people navigate the court system. "Look at this," Maria said excitedly, showing Sarah her phone. The local courts had just launched a new app where people could report unfair treatment. It also provided free legal advice and translated court documents into multiple languages. "And guess what?" Maria added, bouncing her baby on her knee. "They're naming it the Mitchell Report System after you." Sarah smiled, remembering that tense morning in traffic court. "It's not about me," she said. "It's about making sure everyone gets treated fairly." Back at her office, Sarah reviewed the latest draft of her Judicial Accountability Act. The bill had gained strong support from both political parties. It would require regular reviews of court decisions, create a national database to track judicial bias, and make it easier for people to report unfair treatment. "The president wants to meet tomorrow," Rachel said. "He's thinking of making this a national priority." That evening, Sarah visited the courthouse where it all began. The building looked different now. New signs in multiple languages welcomed visitors. A help desk staffed by volunteer lawyers offered free advice. Security guards had undergone new training in respectful treatment. As she walked through the halls, a young black law student stopped her. "Congresswoman Mitchell, your story inspired me to become a judge. I want to make sure everyone gets real justice." Sarah thought about how much had changed in just 1 month. The traffic court that had once been a place of fear and frustration for many was becoming a place of true justice. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from her father. "Proud of you, baby girl. You didn't just fight for yourself, you fought for everyone." Looking around the transformed courthouse, Sarah knew there was still much work to do. But something important had started here. Sometimes it took one small moment of injustice to spark big changes. As she left the building, she touched her congressional pin, remembering how it had helped expose the truth. That the real victory wasn't in the pin. It was in making sure that someday, no one would need a special title to receive justice. 6 months had passed since that fateful morning in traffic court. Sarah Mitchell stood at the podium in the White House Rose Garden, preparing to watch the president sign the Judicial Accountability Act into law. The sun shone brightly as hundreds of people gathered to witness this historic moment. In the front row sat Maria and her baby, now a symbol of the movement for court reform. Next to them was former Judge Henderson, who had surprised everyone by becoming an advocate for change. After losing his position, he had started working with civil rights groups to identify and correct bias in the legal system. "This law," the president announced, holding up his pen, "will ensure that justice truly is blind in every courtroom across America." He turned to Sarah with a smile. "And it all started because one congresswoman got a traffic ticket." The crowd laughed, but Sarah remembered how serious that day had been. She looked around at how much had changed in 6 months. The old courthouse had been transformed. Where Judge Henderson once sat, a new judge named Maria Rodriguez now presided. She was the first Hispanic woman to serve on that court, and she made sure every person who entered her courtroom was treated with respect. Officer Peterson had completed his retraining and now taught other officers about bias awareness. Last week, he had apologized to Sarah in person, admitting that the traffic stop had opened his eyes to his own prejudices. "I never thought about how my actions affected people," he had told her. "Now I think about it every day." The Mitchell Report System, the app Maria had helped create, was now used in 40 states. People could easily report unfair treatment, get free legal help, and find court documents in their own language. Over 10,000 cases of bias had been identified and corrected because of it. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message. It was a photo from a courthouse in Texas, showing their new sign. "Justice sees no color, only truth." Similar changes were happening in courthouses across the country. After the signing ceremony, Sarah walked through the crowd, stopping to hug Maria. "Remember that parking ticket?" Maria laughed, her baby now walking and holding her hand. Who knew it would lead to all this? The evening news would show the law's signing, but they would also show something else. Courtrooms across America changing for the better. Security guards greeting everyone with respect. Judges taking time to listen to each case. Fines being fair and equal for all. Congresswoman called out a young reporter, "What's next after this law?" Sarah smiled, thinking of all the work still ahead. "This law is just the beginning," she replied. "Real change happens when every person, in every courtroom, knows they will be treated fairly." Back in her office that evening, Sarah looked at a new photo on her wall. It showed her, Maria, and dozens of others who had shared their stories of facing bias in court. Below it hung a framed yellow traffic light, a reminder of how small moments could lead to big changes. Rachel brought in the latest statistics. Court fines were now almost equal across all races. Complaints of bias had dropped by 60%. More importantly, people's trust in the courts was growing. Oh, and this came for you. Rachel handed her an envelope. Inside was a letter from a high school student. Dear Congresswoman Mitchell, today I saw a judge who looks like me for the first time. Thank you for showing us that we can change things when we stand up for what's right. Sarah thought about that morning 6 months ago when she had stood at Judge Henderson's bench, holding her congressional pin. The pin had given her power that day, but the real victory was making sure that power wasn't necessary anymore. As the sun set over Washington, D.C., courthouses across the country were changing their signs. The words above each door now read the same message: equal justice under law, and finally, those words were becoming true. Sarah's phone buzzed one last time. It was a message from her father. How's it feel to change the world, baby girl? She looked out at the city lights, thinking of all the people who would now find fair treatment in America's courts. The world changes, she typed back, when we make sure justice works the same way for everyone. The traffic ticket that had started it all hung framed on her wall, a reminder that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of standing up for what's right.